I didn't understand it at the time, but I do now. When my daughters started talking about our family's factories and properties, they spoke as if the story of our wealth had started with them. Not with my father, and certainly not with me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Little phrases here and there. The way they spoke about our buildings, our land, our future inheritance, as if the decades in between had somehow disappeared. My father built the first factory when I was 23, a noisy metal plant outside Cleveland. I remember the smell of oil and hot steel. I remember sitting at a desk with stacks of invoices taller than my coffee mug. After he passed, everything came to me. Factories, commercial buildings, thousands of acres of land. And for the next 60 years, I managed it all. But recently, when my daughters spoke about that empire, they spoke as if I had simply been standing in the room while it existed. Not the woman who spent a lifetime protecting it. And the strange thing is this. I didn't notice the shift right away. But once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Welcome to Life Voices, where family drama turns into late-life justice. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
I still drive my own car. I still walk the south edge of the family land every morning, just past the old stone fence where my father used to stand with his hands behind his back and talk about drainage, soil, and timing. I still review quarterly reports from our factories. I still read every lease renewal on our commercial buildings before I sign my name. Age slows the body. That part is true. My knees complain more than they used to. My hands are not as quick with a pen. And by evening, I get tired in a way I never did at 50 or 60. But age does not erase judgment. It does not erase memory. And it does not erase the weight of a lifetime spent making decisions other people were too frightened, too lazy, or too inexperienced to make for themselves. That is what my daughters never understood. They looked at my age and saw fragility. I looked at my life and saw proof. For more than 6 decades, I did not simply look after what my father left behind. I expanded it, protected it, held it together through recessions, lawsuits, labor strikes, tax changes, storms, and one fire that nearly took out an entire warehouse in Indiana. When my father died, there were men who assumed I would sell everything within a year. Some of them even said so to my face. One banker leaned back in his chair, smiled at me like I was a child playing office, and said, "Mrs. Bell, this is a complicated portfolio. You may find it easier to let experienced people take over." I smiled back and asked him if he had actually read the operating reports from our machining plants. He had not. I had. That was the first of many rooms where I learned something simple. People will question a woman faster than they will question a spreadsheet. So I let them underestimate me. Then I outworked them. My daughters grew up inside that life, but not inside the responsibility of it. They saw Christmas parties in hotel ballrooms. They saw drivers, housekeepers, and private schools. They saw summer weeks at the lake house and college paid in full. What they did not see clearly, because children rarely do, was the cost. They did not see me at the dining room table at midnight, going over contracts with my reading lamp on and my dinner still untouched beside me. They did not see the years when I skipped vacations because 2 properties needed refinancing and 1 factory needed new equipment. They did not hear the calls that came after midnight when a tenant flooded a building, or when a foreman quit, or when a county hearing threatened one of our land deals. They did not understand that wealth is not a pile of money sitting quietly in a vault. It is work, it is pressure, it is risk, and if you want to keep it, it is attention. Constant attention. Even now, at 88, I know the names of our plant managers. I know which roof on which commercial building still needs replacing before winter. I know which piece of farmland should never be sold because the highway expansion 10 years from now will double its value. I know these things because I stayed awake for them. Because I paid attention when paying attention was not glamorous. Because my father taught me that ownership is not about having. It is about carrying. That lesson shaped my whole life. And I carried it. I carried it when I was widowed at 52. I carried it when the market turned ugly in the 80s. I carried it when one of my daughters called me cold because I refused to sell land that had been in our family for 3 generations just to make life feel simpler. Simple has never impressed me. Stable has. Last spring, I drove myself out to the Western Tract after a storm. A large oak had come down near the old access road, and one of the groundsmen told me I didn't need to come look at it myself. I went anyway. The air still smelled like wet bark and mud. My shoes sank into the soft ground. The wind had that clean smell that only comes after heavy rain. I stood there with my cane in one hand and looked over 200 acres my father once walked with me when I was a girl. That morning, I remember thinking something very clearly. I may be old, but I am not finished. Maybe that is what unsettles people. An older woman who still knows exactly where everything came from. An older woman who still reads the numbers. An older woman who is not confused, not retired from her own mind, and not waiting quietly in the corner for younger hands to take over what they did not build. My daughters liked to tell people I was still sharp. I noticed that phrase, still sharp, as if it were surprising, as if competence at my age were a charming little trick. No, it was not a trick. It was discipline practiced for so long that it became character. And the truth is, I think my daughters mistook my calm for weakness. Because I do not raise my voice. I do not slam doors. I do not perform strength in loud, theatrical ways. But I know what belongs to me. I know what I built with my own hands, my own judgment, and my own years. And by the time I began to understand what my daughters were really doing, one thing was already very clear to me. They had forgotten who I was. I had not. Looking back now, the signs were already there. At the time, I thought my daughters were simply being practical. Families talk about the future. They talk about wills, estates, and what happens one day. At 88, I understood that better than anyone. But the tone slowly changed. It started with small questions. Casual ones. Mom, do you still handle all the factory reports yourself? Mom, have you ever thought about selling some of the smaller properties? Mom, wouldn't life be easier if the girls helped manage things? At first, I answered the way I always had. Calmly, factually. Yes, I still review the reports. No, the smaller properties are long-term investments. And no, I don't need help managing my own estate. They would nod, smile politely. Then the subject would move on. At least, that's what I thought. But later, when I replayed those conversations in my mind, I realized something subtle. They were not asking questions. They were measuring how much I remembered, measuring how firm my answers were, measuring how much control I still held. One afternoon last autumn, my younger daughter, Melissa, sat across from me at the breakfast table. She stirred her coffee for a long time before speaking. Mom, she said, have you updated your will recently? I looked up from the financial report I was reading. Why do you ask? She shrugged. Oh, just planning things. It's important to keep those documents current. I folded the report slowly. My lawyer and I review everything regularly. She smiled. Good, that's good. Then she added something that felt strange even at the time. You've done such a good job protecting Grandpa's legacy. Grandpa's legacy, not our family's, not my work. Grandpa's. At the time I let it pass. But once a phrase like that enters your mind, it lingers. A few weeks later, my older daughter, Caroline, came to visit. We were walking through the orchard behind the main house. Leaves were already turning yellow. She glanced toward the distant warehouse buildings across the highway. She said casually, that land must be worth a fortune as commercial development. It is already commercial property, I replied. Yes, she said, but imagine selling it. A developer could build hundreds of apartments. I stopped walking. That land supports 3 of our manufacturing facilities. She gave a small laugh. Well, factories are old-fashioned. Real estate development is where the real money is now. That comment stayed with me longer than it should have. Because my daughters had grown up watching those factories operate. They knew the workers. They knew the managers. Those buildings were not abstract investments. They were living businesses. But Caroline spoke about them the way someone talks about unused furniture in a storage unit. Something to liquidate. Something to convert into cash. Later that evening, both daughters sat in the living room while I poured tea. They began discussing properties again. The farmland in Ohio, the warehouses near Indianapolis, the office buildings outside Chicago. But something was different. They spoke about them as if ownership had already shifted. Once everything is eventually ours. When we manage the estate, we'll probably restructure most of it. I sat quietly in my chair and listened. At first, I told myself this was natural. Children assume they will inherit. That is not unusual, but the way they spoke about it felt premature, almost rehearsed, as if the future they imagined had already begun, as if my role in that story had quietly ended. That was the first moment I felt something unsettled inside me. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet discomfort, the kind that appears when a familiar room suddenly feels unfamiliar. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. They were my daughters. I had raised them. I had paid for their education. I had helped them start their own lives. Surely they understood what this empire represented. Surely they understood who had protected it for 60 years. At least, that is what I believed. Until the afternoon I heard a conversation that changed everything. I wasn't meant to hear it. But sometimes the truth enters a room without knocking. And once it does, you can never pretend you didn't hear it. The moment that changed everything happened on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing dramatic, no argument, no shouting, just a quiet conversation I was never meant to hear. Both of my daughters had come over for lunch. We ate in the dining room like we often did. Chicken salad, iced tea, nothing fancy. They stayed longer than usual afterward, sitting in the living room while I went upstairs to get a folder from my office. I walk slower these days, so I take my time on the stairs. When I came back down, I heard their voices before they saw me. They were speaking softly, but the house is old. Sound carries. Well, technically it was Grandpa's empire, Caroline said. I stopped halfway down the staircase. Melissa replied, exactly. Mom just managed things after he passed. I stood very still, not because I was angry, because I was trying to understand what I had just heard. Caroline continued, let's be honest. She didn't build it from nothing. Grandpa did the real work. Melissa laughed quietly. Yes, but she did keep everything together. I'll give her that. Kept everything together. That was the phrase she chose. As if 60 years of decisions, negotiations, and risks were simply housekeeping. I stayed where I was, out of sight behind the curve of the staircase. Their conversation continued, casual and relaxed. Like people discussing furniture they planned to rearrange. We should really start thinking long-term, Caroline said. When everything eventually transfers to us. Melissa replied quickly. Well, the factories are the first thing I'd sell. My stomach tightened. Why? Caroline asked. Because they're worth more as land than as factories, Melissa said. The equipment is outdated anyway. A developer would tear everything down and build logistics centers or apartments. I looked toward the window from the staircase. Those factories employed hundreds of people. Some of their fathers and grandfathers had worked there before them. But in my daughters' voices, there was no hesitation. No memory, just calculation. Caroline seemed to consider it. Yes, she said slowly. The land alone is probably worth hundreds of millions. Then Melissa said something that made the air feel colder. And honestly, Mom doesn't really understand modern markets anymore. There was a small pause. Then she added quietly, she's almost 90. The words landed heavier than any insult. Not because they were loud, but because they were said so easily, so confidently, as if I were already fading from the room. Caroline didn't object. Instead, she said, that's why we need to start preparing. Once she steps back, we'll have to reorganize everything. Steps back. I stood there for a long moment on that staircase. Listening, not interrupting, not announcing my presence, just absorbing something I had never fully seen before. My daughters were not discussing a future after my lifetime. They were discussing a future where my lifetime no longer mattered, where my work was a footnote, where the story of our family began with their grandfather, skipped the 60 years I carried the weight of it, and continued with them. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Quietly, permanently. I didn't confront them. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't walk into the room. Instead, I turned slowly and went back upstairs. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply listen, and what I had just heard told me more than any argument ever could. I stayed upstairs for several minutes. Not because I was shocked. At 88, very little shocks me anymore. But I needed silence. When you hear something that changes the way you see your own family, your mind doesn't react with drama. It reacts with quiet calculation. I walked into my office and sat down at the old oak desk my father once used. The same desk where I had signed contracts, reviewed balance sheets, and negotiated land purchases for more than half a century. My hands rested on the polished surface. I remember looking at them and thinking something very simple. These hands built the middle 60 years of that empire. Not just managed it. Built it, expanded it, protected it when others would have sold it piece by piece. Downstairs, I could still hear my daughters talking faintly. Their voices floated up the staircase like distant radio static. They were laughing now, discussing redevelopment, apartment complexes, new investors, words like modernization and liquidation. I closed my office door quietly, not because I wanted to block out the sound, but because I had already heard enough. Something else was becoming clear to me in that moment. My daughters were not cruel people. They had simply convinced themselves of a different version of our family's story. In their version, my father created the empire. Time passed, and eventually it would belong to them. The 60 years in between, the years where I carried the entire weight of that responsibility. Those years had faded in their minds. That realization did not make me angry. It made me thoughtful, because when people rewrite the past, it usually means they are already planning the future. And I suddenly understood something else. This conversation on the staircase was not the real problem. It was only the beginning of it. The cruelest part was not what they said about the factories. It was what they said about me. A few days after I overheard that conversation on the staircase, both of my daughters came by again. They acted perfectly normal. Too normal, really. Melissa brought lemon cookies from a bakery I like. Caroline complimented the roses by the front walk. They kissed my cheek, sat in my living room, and spoke in those soft, careful voices people use when they are pretending everything is fine. I watched them the whole time. Not suspiciously, just clearly. There is a difference. When you are young, you think truth arrives like thunder. Loud, obvious, impossible to miss. But at my age, I have learned that truth usually arrives dressed in politeness. It sits on your sofa. It crosses its legs. It asks whether you have been sleeping well. That afternoon, Caroline asked if I had spoken with my attorney recently. I said, "Why?" She smiled. "No reason. I just think it's smart to keep things organized." Melissa added, "Especially now." I looked at her. "Especially now?" She gave a little shrug. "Well, you know, at your age." There it was again. Not concern. Positioning. A quiet attempt to place me in a category. I said nothing. Caroline picked up her teacup and looked around the room. "This house is still beautiful. But honestly, Mom, it must be exhausting for you to keep up with all of this." "It is not exhausting," I said. Melissa gave me a patient smile. "You may not realize how much harder things are getting." That sentence bothered me more than it should have. Because it was not really about the house, or the property, or my schedule. It was about authority. They were testing language, testing roles, moving me, inch by inch, out of the seat I had occupied for most of my life. I answered calmly, "I realize exactly how much I handle." Caroline leaned forward then, folding her hands in her lap the way she used to when she was about to say something difficult as a child. "Mom, please don't take this the wrong way. People always say that right before they say the thing they know is wrong." She continued, "We just think it may be time to simplify. For your own good." Melissa nodded quickly. "Nobody is saying you can't still be involved. Still be involved. As if I were a guest in my own life. As if the best I could hope for now was ceremonial relevance." I could feel the room changing around me. Not physically, emotionally. The temperature of it, the balance of it. My daughters were no longer speaking to me as daughters speak to a mother. They were speaking to me as future handlers speak to a current obstacle. That realization was painful enough. But then came the line I have never forgotten. Melissa set down her cup and said it in a low, practical tone, almost as if she were doing me a kindness. "Mom doesn't really understand these things anymore." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Then Caroline, instead of correcting her, said softly, "She understands the old way. But the market is different now." Melissa sighed. "Exactly. She's almost 90. We can't keep pretending she's still running everything." That was the moment. Not the staircase. Not the talk about selling factories. That sentence. We can't keep pretending. Pretending. As if my work were make-believe. As if my judgment were an old woman's hobby. As if the reports I still reviewed, the contracts I still negotiated, the land values I knew better than any appraiser they had ever hired, none of it was real. I sat there in my own living room and let the words settle. They did not know that I had spent the morning reviewing occupancy data on 3 commercial buildings. They did not know that I had caught an error in a materials forecast the week before. They did not know that I still knew which properties carried debt, which ones were clean, which managers were capable, and which ones were coasting on reputation. Or maybe they did know. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe it was easier for them to take control if they first reduced me in their minds. Made me smaller, made me weaker, made me into someone whose history could be gently dismissed. I wish I could tell you I answered sharply. I wish I could tell you I stood up and reminded them who kept the banks from carving up this estate after their grandfather died. Who sat across from union lawyers. Who refinanced warehouses during bad years. Who turned a handful of factories into an empire large enough for my daughters to casually discuss over tea. But I didn't say any of that. I just looked at them. And that may have unsettled them more than anger would have. Because calm has a way of making other people hear themselves. Caroline cleared her throat. We're only trying to help. Melissa added, we're worried about you. No, they weren't. They were worried about timing. Worried about access. Worried that if they waited too long, the decisions would still be mine. I knew it then as surely as I have ever known anything. The insult was not simply that they thought I was old. I am old. I have no quarrel with the truth. The insult was that they believed age erased authorship. That because I was nearing the end of my life, they could quietly reach back and erase the middle of it. My father built the beginning. Yes, but I built everything that survived after him. And sitting there, listening to my daughters talk about me as if I were confused, decorative, and nearly finished, I felt something deep inside me go still. Not broken, still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a decision. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask how long they had been speaking about me that way. Because suddenly, I understood something with perfect clarity. When people need to call you incapable before asking for control, it means they already know the control is not theirs. And that, more than anything, told me exactly what was coming next. I didn't argue with my daughters that afternoon. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I did something that has served me well for most of my life. I listened. People reveal more in comfort than they ever reveal under pressure. When someone feels safe speaking, they stop editing themselves. They say what they truly believe. So I let the silence sit between us. Melissa shifted in her chair. Caroline glanced at the window. They expected a reaction. Anger, perhaps. Or wounded pride. But calm can be more unsettling than either. Finally Caroline said, Mom, we're only talking about making things easier for you. I nodded slightly. I see. Melissa leaned forward a little. You've carried this responsibility for so long. Nobody expects you to keep doing it forever. That sentence was carefully chosen. Nobody expects you to keep doing it. Not whether I could, whether I should. I folded my hands in my lap and asked a simple question. What exactly do you think I should stop doing? They exchanged a quick glance. That glance told me something important. They had already discussed this privately. Caroline spoke first. Well, maybe the factories. Melissa added quickly, and some of the commercial properties. Those are complicated, Caroline said. They require constant oversight. I waited. Melissa continued. We just think it would be better if we started taking over some of those responsibilities. Started taking over. Not helping. Not assisting. Taking over. Still, I didn't react. I simply nodded again and said, I see. The room grew quiet. When you refuse to fight, people sometimes become strangely uncomfortable. Caroline finally said, You don't seem surprised. I smiled faintly. At my age, very little surprises me. That answer seemed to settle them. They relaxed slightly. Melissa leaned back in her chair. That's good, she said. Because this conversation was going to happen eventually anyway. There it was again, that sense of inevitability, as if the future had already been scheduled. For several minutes they continued talking. About restructuring, about modernizing, about hiring younger consultants who understood current markets. I let them speak, not because I agreed, because I was learning how far their thinking had already gone. At one point Caroline said something that stayed with me. You've done an incredible job protecting Grandpa's empire. Again, Grandpa's empire, not the businesses I had expanded, not the properties I had negotiated. Just Grandpa. History was being quietly rearranged. The founder mattered, the heirs mattered, but the 60 years between those 2 points, the years I had lived and worked inside, were being treated like a temporary holding period. Eventually the conversation slowed. Melissa checked the time on her phone. Caroline finished the last sip of her tea. Neither of them realized what had happened during that hour. They believed they had begun preparing me for transition. What they had actually done was reveal their entire strategy. When they stood to leave, Melissa kissed my cheek. "We just want what's best for you," she said gently. Caroline added, "and for the future of the family." I walked them to the door. The afternoon sun was low, casting long shadows across the front lawn. As they stepped onto the driveway, Caroline turned back. "You'll think about what we said, right?" I nodded calmly. "Yes," I said, "I will." And that was the truth. Because silence is not the same thing as agreement. Sometimes silence is simply the space where a decision begins forming. After they drove away, I closed the front door and stood in the quiet hallway. The house felt larger than usual. Older. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. I walked slowly into my study and sat at my desk. For a long moment, I did nothing. Just sat there, thinking, not about my daughters, not about the insult, not even about the factories. I was thinking about something else. Timing. Because there is a difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is emotional. Response is strategic. And if my daughters believed I was no longer capable of understanding what was happening around me, then they had just given me the greatest advantage a person can have in business. Underestimation. I reached for the phone on my desk. Then I paused. Not yet. There was still one more thing I needed to see. Because when people begin preparing to take control, they rarely stop with conversation alone. Sooner or later, documents appear. A week later, my daughters came back. This time they did not bring cookies. They brought a folder. I noticed it the moment Melissa walked into the house. A dark leather folder tucked neatly under her arm, the kind lawyers use when they want something to look official but friendly at the same time. We sat in the living room again. Same chairs, same table, same polite smiles, but the air felt different. Caroline waited until I finished pouring tea before speaking. "Mom," she said gently, "we brought something we thought you might want to look at." Melissa placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "Just routine paperwork," she said. Routine. That word has always interested me. In business, the most dangerous decisions are often hidden behind words that sound harmless. Routine. Standard. Administrative. I adjusted my glasses and looked at the folder. "Routine for whom?" I asked. Melissa gave a little laugh. "For all of us, really." Caroline opened the folder and slid a stack of papers toward me. "We spoke with an estate consultant," she said. "Just to explore options." Explore options. Another careful phrase. I picked up the first page. The paper was heavy. Legal quality. At the top, in bold type, were the words, "Estate Management Authorization." I read the first paragraph slowly. Then the second. Halfway down the page, a line caught my attention. "Primary operational authority assigned to designated family representatives." I turned the page. There they were. 2 names. Caroline Bell, Melissa Bell. I continued reading. The document granted them authority to oversee the management of family assets. Factories, commercial buildings, land holdings, financial structures, effective immediately. My daughters were sitting quietly while I read, watching my face carefully. Melissa finally spoke. "It's just a way to help you," she said softly. Caroline added, "You would still own everything." Own, but not control. I kept reading. Several pages described how day-to-day decision-making would be transferred to them. Operational authority, strategic oversight, asset liquidation if deemed necessary. Liquidation. That word appeared 3 times. I placed the papers back on the table. Neither of them spoke. They were waiting. Waiting for confusion. Waiting for hesitation. Waiting for an elderly woman to feel overwhelmed by legal language. But I have been reading contracts longer than my daughters have been alive. Finally I asked a simple question. "When were these prepared?" Caroline answered quickly. "Last week." Melissa added, "We just want to take the pressure off you." Take the pressure off. That was the story they had prepared. I nodded slowly. Then I turned to the last page. The signature line, my name, Margaret Bell, waiting neatly at the bottom of the page. Caroline slid a pen across the table. We thought it would be best to get everything organized sooner rather than later. Melissa smiled gently. You don't have to keep carrying everything by yourself. The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the road. I looked again at the document. Not confused, not upset, just thoughtful, because this was the moment I had been expecting since that conversation on the staircase. The moment where concern turns into paperwork, where family conversations quietly become legal control. I set the pen back on the table. Then I looked up at my daughters. I appreciate the effort, I said calmly. They both leaned forward slightly. Encouraged, but I never signed documents the first time I read them. Melissa blinked. Oh, well, of course. Caroline forced a small smile. You can take your time. I will, I said. I closed the folder and slid it back toward them. I'll have my lawyer review it. That sentence changed the room immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Caroline sat back in her chair. Melissa cleared her throat. Well, that's not really necessary, she said carefully. But I simply smiled. In my experience, I said, legal documents are always worth reviewing carefully. They nodded, but the warmth had faded. Because in that moment they realized something. The old woman they believed was drifting toward irrelevance was still reading every line. I did exactly what I told them I would do. I had my lawyer review the documents. The next morning, after my daughters left with their polite smiles and careful words, I sat in my study and made a phone call I had made many times over the years. Good morning, Daniel, I said when he answered. Daniel Brooks has been my attorney for 23 years. Before him, his father represented my family. Some relationships in life are built slowly, over decades, through quiet trust and shared understanding. Margaret, he said warmly. What can I do for you? I have a document I'd like you to look at. There was a short pause. Anything urgent? No, I said calmly. But it is interesting. I drove to his office that afternoon myself. Yes, I still drive. It takes me a little longer than it used to. I'm careful with turns and I avoid heavy traffic when I can. But independence is something you don't surrender lightly once you've built a life around it. Daniel greeted me in the conference room. Gray suit, same calm eyes he has always had. I placed the folder on the table and slid it toward him. My daughters brought this yesterday. He opened it and began reading. Daniel is a careful reader. He doesn't skim. He moves slowly, line by line, the way a surgeon studies an X-ray before making the first incision. The room stayed quiet while he worked through the pages. About 10 minutes later, he leaned back in his chair. Well, he said quietly. That's ambitious. I folded my hands in front of me. What does it do? I asked. He tapped the paper. It transfers operational authority for nearly every major asset you own. I nodded. That's what I thought. He turned another page. It would allow them to restructure the companies, sell properties, refinance assets, without your direct approval. I watched him carefully. Even while I'm alive? Daniel looked up at me. Yes. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply confirmation. Finally, he said something that made me smile slightly. They were hoping you wouldn't read this closely. I laughed quietly. That has been happening to me my entire life. He closed the folder and pushed it gently back toward me. Margaret, if you signed this document, control of your entire business structure would effectively shift to your daughters. Immediately? Immediately. I sat back in my chair. Not shocked. Not angry. Just thoughtful. Daniel studied my face. You don't seem surprised. I'm not. He waited a moment before asking the question every lawyer eventually asks. What would you like to do? I looked out the conference room window. Across the street, a small construction crew was repairing a sidewalk. One of the workers knelt carefully with a measuring tape, making sure the alignment was perfect before pouring the next section of concrete. Precision. That word has always mattered to me. Finally, I looked back at Daniel. I'd like to make some adjustments. His eyebrow lifted slightly. What kind of adjustments? I leaned forward a little. Structural ones. Daniel smiled faintly. Now that sounds like the Margaret Bell I know. I opened the folder again and tapped the page where my name appeared above the signature line. My daughters believe they are preparing to take control of my estate. He nodded. That appears to be the plan. I folded the page closed. But what they haven't realized, I said calmly, is that I'm still the one designing the structure they'll inherit. Daniel sat back in his chair. And you'd like to redesign it? Yes. He reached for a notepad. All right, he said. Let's talk about how you want the future to look. For the next hour, we discussed something my daughters had clearly forgotten. Ownership. Not the kind that appears on paper. The kind that comes from understanding every piece of a system you built yourself. We talked about trusts, governance structures, asset protection, operational oversight, and one particular clause that Daniel suggested quietly, almost casually. A continuity condition, he called it. I listened carefully. Then I nodded. Yes, I said, that would work perfectly. When our meeting ended, Daniel walked me to the elevator. Margaret, he said before the doors closed, your daughters believe they're planning the future. I smiled. They are, but not the way they think. Because sometimes the most important decisions in a family are not made during arguments. They're made quietly, in conference rooms, with documents that only one person truly understands. And as I drove home that afternoon, one thought stayed very clear in my mind. My daughters believed they were preparing to inherit my story. On the drive home from Daniel's office, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity, not anger, not revenge, just clarity. My daughters believed they were protecting the future of the family. What they didn't understand was that the future of this family had always depended on one simple thing. Responsibility. My father built the first factories with his hands and his instincts. I spent 60 years protecting what he started, expanding it, holding it steady when the world around us changed. That kind of responsibility leaves a mark on a person. It teaches you to watch carefully, to act slowly, and to make decisions that last longer than emotions. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. I walked through the hallway, past the old photographs on the wall. My father standing beside the first factory building. My daughters as little girls running through the orchard behind this house. For a moment, I stood there and looked at those pictures. Families change over time, memories soften, and sometimes people convince themselves of stories that are easier to live with. But facts don't change just because someone prefers a different version of them. I went into my study and sat at my desk. The same desk where I had signed contracts for decades. On the corner of the desk sat the folder my daughters had brought. I opened it again, estate management authorization, my name waiting at the bottom. I closed it gently, then I placed it in the drawer beside me. Because my daughters believed this document was the beginning of their control. But they didn't realize something important. The real documents had not even been written yet. And when they were, the story of our family would finally be told the right way. My daughters believed they were preparing for the future. They talked about inheritance as if it were already sitting in their hands. Factories, buildings, land, but inheritance is not just property. It is responsibility, and responsibility reveals people in ways money never can. When I finished restructuring the estate with my attorney, nothing looked different on the surface. The factories still operated, the properties still generated income, the family name still stood on the buildings my father once dreamed about. But one thing had quietly changed. The future now required something my daughters had forgotten. Respect. Because wealth without respect destroys families. And history rewritten for convenience never survives long. My daughters believed they were preparing to inherit my story. But they forgot something simple. I was the one who lived it. And I am still the one deciding what happens to it. Now I'm curious. What would you have done in my place?
Your voice matters here. Share your story below. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Have you ever lived through something similar? Share in the comments. Your voice matters here.